I remember the exact expression on everyone's face that day, frozen, wide-eyed, stunned. It was the kind of disbelief that spread through Sunnyside Grove like a brush fire, ignited by something so outrageous it didn't feel real. Henry Dalton, a 74-year-old Marine veteran who had served 3 tours in Vietnam, was quietly maneuvering his motorized wheelchair away from the annual neighborhood picnic. His chair, usually kept in impeccable condition, was now streaked with neon pink and green silly string, the foam clinging to his controls and wheels like cruel graffiti. Standing behind him with a self-satisfied smirk and an empty can in hand was Margaret Leland, our reigning Homeowners Association president. Dressed in her usual spotless white capris and pearl-button cardigan, she casually tossed the can into a nearby trash bin and muttered something about maintaining the visual integrity of the neighborhood. Henry's face remained unreadable stoic. Composed as he quietly rolled away, dignity clinging to him despite the fluorescent humiliation. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying. A few neighbors began drifting toward Margaret, aghast and angry, but she just smoothed her hair and walked off as though she'd just performed a civic duty. She had no idea that within a few hours, she'd be in the back seat of a police cruiser, wrists cuffed behind her, charged with harassment and elder abuse. 5 separate neighbors would submit video evidence of what had happened. One of those witnesses was me. When I moved to Sunnyside Grove just 6 months before that day, the last thing I expected was to find myself pulled into neighborhood drama. I was a remote software developer, quiet, private, drawn to the calm, manicured streets, and strong Wi-Fi signals. The houses were neat, the amenities solid, the HOA fees expensive, but I figured worth it for the pool and walking trails. What the real estate agent failed to mention, however, was that the HOA was less a council of neighbors and more a one-woman regime led by Margaret Leland, a former real estate agent in her late 50s who now seemed to dedicate her life to policing mailbox widths and outlawing wind chimes. Henry Dalton moved in about a month after I did. His homey, a cozy, single-level brick ranch was just 2 doors down from mine. He struck me immediately as someone who lived with intention. Every morning, like clockwork, he raised the American flag in front of his home and beside it, the United States Marine Corps banner. Sometimes, I'd catch him in his front yard, tending to his modest garden of native plants. We'd exchange greetings, and sometimes he'd share stories of his past years of service, his grandkids in Montana, his late wife, Teresa. Most of the neighborhood liked Henry. Mrs. Hossein from across the street brought him biryani and ginger tea. The Reynolds kids offered to take out his trash or help carry groceries. But Margaret? She never warmed to him. Not even slightly. The first real sign of tension happened during the monthly HOA meeting held in the community center's multipurpose room. Henry had arrived late, quietly apologizing as he wheeled himself into the back. Margaret stopped mid-sentence when he entered, her carefully curled hair bouncing as she turned. As I was saying before the interruption, she said, her eyes fixed coldly on Henry. Exterior aesthetics will be our top priority this quarter. She glanced deliberately at Henry's wheelchair, then turned back to her laminated agenda. After the meeting, I overheard her whispering to 2 of her board allies what I'd started calling her Echo Squad, about how visible medical equipment ruined the visual charm of the street. We can't just let every kind of contraption sit out front. What next? Mobility scooters? For poles? She hissed, not even bothering to lower her voice. At first, I dismissed it as typical Margaret nonsense. Everyone knew she had opinions about everything from the type of mulch allowed to the maximum height of yard gnomes. But the glances turned to confrontations. One afternoon, I was coding from my front porch when I saw Margaret storming up Henry's driveway with a clipboard in hand. He was tending to his flower bed beautiful patches of drought-resistant blooms. Margaret hated them. She preferred perfectly mowed lawns, oblivious to the state's water restrictions. "Mr. Dalton," she called out, "I've received complaints about your equipment being left outside. According to Bylaw 7.3, all personal items must be stored out of view." Henry looked up, bemused. "You mean my wheelchair?" "I'm referring to all visible items that detract from the neighborhood's uniformity," she replied, her voice sharp. Your mobility device should be stored inside when not in use. It was absurd. That chair wasn't a decoration, it was his legs. Henry straightened slightly in his chair. With all due respect, Mrs. Leland, this is my only means of getting around. And under federal law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, what you're suggesting is discrimination. Margaret flushed. Maybe you should consider a different neighborhood, one that better suits your situation. And she turned on her heel and marched off. After that, the harassment ramped up. Violation notices appeared on Henry's door, one for having unauthorized flags, another for his unsightly ramp, another still for obstructive potted plants. The fines escalated. The notices became daily. I started documenting everything. Other neighbors did the same. We created a group chat. Every time Margaret stepped foot on Henry's lawn, someone was there to record, to witness. But it was taking a toll. Henry's morning flag ritual grew less frequent. His stories faded. His eyes looked a little dimmer every time we spoke. I didn't survive 3 tours just to be bullied by a clipboard and a cardigan, he said one night, shaking his head slowly. Then came the barbecue. Sunnyside Grove's Memorial Day picnic was Margaret's prized tradition. She coordinated everything from the bunting to the beverages. Somehow, Henry decided to go. He wore his marine dress jacket, metals pinned and polished, slacks perfectly pressed. He looked every bit the honored veteran he was. The gathering was lively. Families chatted, kids ran around with popsicles, someone had brought a karaoke machine. But I noticed Margaret watching Henry from across the lawn, her eyes narrow, jaw tight. She whispered something to her husband, a timid man who mostly lived in her shadow, then vanished inside the community center. When she reappeared, I saw her stuff something into her purse. Henry had parked near a shady patch by the sidewalk, chatting with the Reynolds family about World War II history. I saw Margaret striding toward him, her expression rigid with purpose. "Excuse me," she said loudly, cutting off the conversation. "This matter has gone unaddressed long enough." Henry blinked. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "This chair," she barked, pointing, "has been an aesthetic concern for months. And since verbal reminders haven't worked, perhaps a more visible solution is required." Then, with a flourish, she pulled out a can of neon silly string and sprayed it across his wheelchair. The foam covered the controls, the armrests, even part of his uniform jacket. The crowd gasped. Margaret smiled triumphantly. "There," she said. "Now maybe people will understand what kind of visual clutter this really is." The entire picnic froze. Even the music stopped. Then from behind the Reynolds lemonade table, little Emma Reynolds, 12 years old, brave and brilliant, raised her phone and said, "I recorded the whole thing." Margaret's smile cracked. Her head jerked toward the crowd. Phones were everywhere. Eyes were wide. She dropped the can and stormed toward her car. That night, Emma's video went viral. Neighbors flooded social media. Local news picked it up. But Margaret's worst surprise came from someone she hadn't expected: Henry's daughter, Melissa. Melissa Dalton wasn't just a lawyer. She was a specialist in elder abuse and disability rights. By morning, a restraining order had been filed. And by the end of the week, Margaret was in handcuffs, arguing with officers on her front porch. "It was just silly string," she shrieked. "It was a joke." But the officers were unmoved. "You're being charged with harassment, elder abuse, and violation of disability protections." Neighbors applauded as the patrol car pulled away. The consequences came swiftly. Margaret was banned from serving on any HOA board for the next 10 years. She was sentenced to 2 years probation, fined $5,000, and ordered to complete 200 hours of community service at the local veteran center. But the most satisfying moment came at the emergency HOA meeting. With dozens in attendance, a unanimous vote removed Margaret as president. She stood silent as the decision was announced, her mouth twitching, eyes darting for allies who no longer existed. "I gave everything to this community," she whispered. "No," said Mrs. Hossain, standing with dignity. "You gave it rules." Henry gave it hard. Margaret fled the meeting. She never returned to another one. And every morning since, Henry raises the flags again, proud, steady and undisturbed. The silly string? That washed away. But what stayed was the reminder that a community isn't built on manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. It's built on respect, on dignity, on people. And in Sunnyside Grove, that truth stood taller than any HOA rule ever could.